Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are coming to you from the McMaster Health Forum at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. We are in the dialogue space at the McMaster Health Forum, and this is our latest in a series of Queen Elizabeth Scholarship webinars that we will be conducting throughout the fall term up into December the 13th. Quick agenda for today's session. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the McMaster Health Forum, a little bit about the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Program, and I'm going to turn it over to Shawn Khan, who's going to be talking to you about his experiences in Kenya working with an organization called Legal Action Worldwide. The McMaster Health Forum is a leading hub for improving health outcomes through collective problem solving. We harness information, convene stakeholders, prepare action-oriented leaders, and act as an agent of change by empowering stakeholders. The Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Program is run by a partnership between the Rita Hall Foundation, Community Foundations of Canada, Universities Canada, and Canadian universities. The purpose is to activate a dynamic community of young global leaders across the Commonwealth to create lasting impacts both at home and abroad through cross-cultural exchanges encompassing international education, discovery and inquiry, and professional experiences. The Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Program here at McMaster and the McMaster Health Forum is called Strengthening Health Systems. Our scholars will contribute to strengthening health systems and become part of our large and growing network of health system leaders. We've had 2 cohorts of scholars so far. The list on your screen is our first cohort, who primarily went away in 2016. And this is our longer list of our second cohort of students who primarily went away in the calendar year of 2017. Our last cohort will be going away in 2018. From that second cohort of students, we have our outgoing Kiwi scholar who is an intern, and that's Shawn Khan. At the time of his internship, he was a student here at McMaster University in the Bachelor of Health Sciences undergraduate program. He had his interest in an international best practice standards of documenting human rights violations to help train legal response providers and collecting evidence to a standard that can be used in court. He has gained an appreciation for the framework of setting clear agendas, developing a policy, and implementing a structure that allows for a dynamic community of health actors to respond to health, human rights injustices. Shawn is now a student in the University of Toronto's MD program, and it is a great pleasure that I will introduce him to you now and turn it over to him. Shawn?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Shawn, and I did my So today I'll be talking about my internship at Legal Action Worldwide as part of my internship with the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Program and the McMaster Health Forum. So to start, I'll specifically be talking about the timeline in terms of how I got my project running and I guess where I'm at right now. I'll be talking about the learning goals I had going into my internship, why I chose Legal Action Worldwide and what I did there, and then concluding by my overall experience in Kenya. So I knew in the beginning that I was interested in an international project, and I knew that took a lot of time to prepare. So I applied for the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Program in July 2016. I started contacting my organization, Legal Action Worldwide, in August, and it took a bit of time to actually get things rolling, especially contacting an organization abroad. I finally started submitting my forms in January, and it took until April to actually get that approved. And during that, we had regular sessions with the other QA scholars in February. And I started my internship in May, and then I ended end of July, early August. And so going into my internship, I had a few learning goals, some that were academic, some that had to do with learning about society and politics, and then some that were more personal. My main learning objective, I guess, was to understand the way laws and legal advocacy played a role in health systems. After all, my mindset was that you can create a perfect health system for sexual assault and rape survivors, but if the law doesn't classify them as a victim, you can't really arrange health services to those marginalized populations. And I want to understand how to bring issues up to the forefront of agendas and identify problems. And I wanted to better understand and better be able to digest social science literature and learn more about regional and international law because if you're a key stakeholder, it's important, in my opinion. I also wanted to learn about society and culture, especially going abroad to an environment that was unfamiliar to me. And I wanted to understand the history and the politics around that culture. And personally, I wanted to do the project in a way that respected their culture, in a way that abided by ethics, and just get to know other health policymakers, legal advocates, and healthcare practitioners. And so the reason I chose Legal Action Worldwide was I came across an article along with a friend that talked about the innovative solutions towards sexual assault and female genital mutilation victims. They're a nonprofit organization, and they work in quite low resource areas where there's not a lot of attention towards the issues that are happening there. A lot of times when there's areas where there's a lot of violence and conflict, some organizations stay away from them because they don't think it's possible to ensure human rights and stability. But that's what draws Legal Action Worldwide to those areas. And they focus on sexual violence and accountability of peacekeepers, and they work also in natural resource exploitation. Legal Action Worldwide is an international law firm, so they have an office in Nairobi, Kenya, but also in Geneva, Switzerland, and the UK. And in Africa, they focus on more of the sexual violence aspect. And just last week, one of my supervisors, Claire Brown, was featured in the Huffington Post about her work as a human rights lawyer. And she just talked about the start of the organization and what the landscape looked like. She talked about how in Somalia, 5 people were arrested for reporting rape, and only 3 were arrested for actually committing rape. And it was just that environment where there's little accountability, little justice, and so that's why that law firm started up in Nairobi. And I do want to clarify that this law firm is in Nairobi, Kenya, but they didn't do work in Kenya. And the rationale is that they didn't want to antagonize the government they're in. Rather, they'd want to do work in surrounding regions like Somalia and South Sudan. And so in terms of my work at law, it did focus very similarly on female genital mutilation and sexual violence. And in terms of like the stakeholder health systems aspect of it, it has a lot to do with setting an agenda and identifying priority areas. There's a lot of NGOs in the area, so it can be very tough to promote the issues you care about amongst all those other NGOs in East Africa. And I looked at, with the law firm, looking at the current legislation and literature. I had opportunities to interview key stakeholders and arranging communications between them. And they also created outreach tools such as infographics and publications. So one example I have is I went to a meeting that was about conflict and famine in Somalia. Earlier this summer there was a pre-famine, and a lot of the attention in Somalia was focused towards that aspect of nutrition and malnutrition. But what's important to consider is that at times of famine and drought, sexual violence also increases. And so it's just that aspect of promoting your issues and making it on the agenda. And the reason this happens is because at times of famine and drought, what we see is that women and heads of the families, they have to walk long distances in order to get food and water. And during those treks to get water, they're often raped like once, even several times on that journey. And while there are protection of civilian camps to protect vulnerable populations, like these families do have to leave in order to get food and resources. And listening to the other Kiwi Scholar webinars, a lot of them seem to be like one issue focus or like one main project, but my experience as a legal intern at law, I had several different projects, some relating to FGM, sexual violence, land disputes, some that had to do with human rights violations, and just attending meetings and doing a bit of grant seeking. In terms of FGM, the issue in East Africa is that And to take a step back, female genital mutilation is the removal of parts or even the entire external female genitalia. And what we see from FGM is that females, they suffer pain while urinating, pain while intercourse, pain during childbirth. So it's a very painful process. They often experience infections and hemorrhaging. And this law firm just was against the practice, but then some people who are for the practice suggested that we should preserve their cultural practice because we shouldn't impose our own Western ideals and pretend to be some white savior. And so it did get really tricky at times, like when are we enforcing our own personal views of morals and ethics, and when are we interfering for the safety of vulnerable populations? And this law firm's view is that when these populations are dying and when they're experiencing severe suffering, that's the point where you draw the line and you have to intervene. And it is tricky because you have to watch the terminology. I was talking to one physician the other week, and he was questioning the terminology of mutilation, because when you start talking about mutilation, you're already talking about it in a language that suggests it's inherently bad, and that could potentially antagonize the people you're trying to convince or work with. So that was a constant, it's one of the main projects they're working on, and it's not just an issue that affects East Africa. What we see is that there's cases of FGM in the United States, and because Canada has a large immigrant population, what we see is that sometimes families are sending their children abroad to get FGM done. And it's important to note that FGM doesn't have any known beneficial health benefits. We just see like pain and health complications in the practice. And it's not a medical practice, and oftentimes it's done without anesthesia. And so what I did with my health background was drafting a report on the physical and psychosocial harms of FGM. And what I found was that there were no health benefits, and psychologically, interestingly enough, the people who undergo the practice, they don't see any psychological morbidity. They're fine with the practice, but the people who want to refuse the practice often experience stigmatization and discrimination. In addition to that, not only did I draft a report, but I also helped interview local NGOs about FGM practices and the scope of their work in that region to collaborate with these stakeholders. And I produced infographics for social media purposes in order to help with knowledge translation. In terms of sexual violence, I did a similar role in terms of looking at the physical and psychosocial harms of sexual violence. And this includes things like rape, gang rape, and what's known as transactional sex. In regions of East Africa, there's peacekeepers, and sometimes they trade food or water for sex from vulnerable populations, and that's considered a form of rape because of that inherent power dynamic. And so I did a lot of projects regarding FGM and sexual violence, but it also helped with the other branches of their work as well. And so this is an example of their work with land disputes. In certain regions of Somalia, there is this dispute between should we follow the rule of land or follow the community elder in terms of how land is divided. And so this law firm, along with UN Habitat, published the harmonization of the legal systems resolving land disputes in Somaliland and Puntland. And to work with this law firm, I helped produce a training manual. And some of that was tricky because Somali lawyers would draft some of the principles up, but then their English wasn't very strong. So we had to kind of decode and fix up the English of it. And I also helped produce the code of conduct by which the tribunals would adhere to. And these are just some examples of the infographics I produced. So if there was an international day, like the World Refugee Day, I'd produce a graphic about the refugees in Syria and South Sudan. I'd also produced a graphic on FGM, and that just helps with that process of knowledge translation. Interestingly enough, today is the International Day of the Girl, and that relates similarly to my internship. And throughout my internship, I had a chance to go to several different types of meetings with several important stakeholders. This one was Amnesty International. I was talking about the Malibu Protocol. And there was several key heads of state, like such as the International Criminal Justice System. And so this is also the UN compound. Karabuni and Swahili means welcome. And just to speak more broadly in terms of my overall experiences, I went to this art show gallery type of thing, and the point of this gallery was that you see so many different pictures of Africa, but they were trying to question what's the real depiction of it. What we see with Africa is it's often portrayed as either like some exotic place or either as this poor, destitute place. And so that, like, this art gallery was kind of making fun of that by, like, the picture on the right. You'd assume, like, this person's pretty poor, I guess, but then this person is just adding another perspective, like that skill right there, adding some comedy to it. And during my time in Kenya, I saw some interesting things, like at the grocery store. They were raising funds for some hunger in the UK. And it's just, like, coming from Canada, there's always that phrase of, like, don't waste your food because there's kids in Africa starving. And here in Africa, they're raising funds for the United Kingdom. And so it's just that difference in perspective. This wasn't like a huge campaign by any means, but it was in the grocery store. This was the place that I worked. It was at this art center compound, but it was like a law firm office. And it was like a really nice environment. I thought the landscape and the greenery was pretty incredible. And because it was an art center, you had some pretty fancy artwork in the compound. While I went to work each day, there was like domestic dogs that would always greet me, and I thought that was like it added really nicely to the environment. And in Kenya, I thought it was really nice to see what was in their newspapers and the different issues they were talking about. And I was in Kenya from May to the end of July, and they had their presidential elections in the beginning of August. So there was a lot of news around Uhuru Kenyatta, who is now the current president. And it was interesting to hear the locals' perspectives about who would win and whether they anticipated violence, because 2 elections ago they experienced severe violence in their cities, and that postponed developmental projects, and it negatively impacted local businesses. And throughout my internship, I had chances to visit different national parks and landscapes. Masai Mara is particularly known for the Great Migration, in which like thousands of wildebeest and zebras and animals cross this river, and it's pretty nice to see the natural animals, the wild animals in their natural habitat. One national park was called Hell's Gate, and you could bike beside zebra without any fence. Other parks had like giraffes and elephants, and throughout I'd send postcards to my family just for fun, and that's stuff I made. And this is Hell's Gate, and interestingly enough, Pride Rock from Pride Rock from that movie is based on this national park. And I did some sports during my internship, and I thought that was pretty cool. I rock climbed for the first time. And that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you very much, Shawn. That was wonderful. Very interesting, very informative. Don't go anywhere. So thank you. We'll open it up for questions. We have a number of people online, people who are here with us in the room. If you have a question, please put your hand up. If you're online and you have a question, I'm going to ask that you please type it into the chat box, and I will read it out for the sake of the recording that we'll upload to YouTube later. So I'll kick things off. I'll ask the first question as I normally do. So this internship that you were involved with is very different than what most of our scholars here at the Forum have experienced. It's a connection between law and health, which is a unique perspective. Could you tell us and the audience, how do you see the work of an organization like law in the legal arena influencing health systems, both in their local area, but also farther reaches?
Okay. I think that's a really important question. And one example I have is their project with the sexual offenses bill. So currently in Somalia, their current laws around sexual violence and rape are based on the Italian penal code, their previous colonizer, and those laws are based on the laws of 1930 in Italy, and they're not very reflective of the current state of health and the violence that happens in Somalia currently. And so what they're working on is drafting a report that's more comprehensive in terms of the crimes that happen there. They're adding laws, I guess, that consider spousal rape and rape against men to be considered rape, I guess, which isn't reflected currently in their legislation. And they were working with the government of Somalia, the Minister of Women, and they're now pushing that sexual offenses bill to the cabinet in order to get it potentially implemented. And so it's that whole process of identifying key issues and promoting it in order to push it towards an agenda. And in doing so, once we have proper definitions of who's considered a rape victim, who's considered a sexual assault victim, we can properly, I guess, direct them to services in our health system.
Thank you. So we've had some questions typed in online, so I'll read them out for everyone to hear. So the first one has to do with your background prior to your internship. So obviously it's a legal organization. You came from the Bachelor of Health Sciences program. You're now an MD student. So what's your legal background, if you have any, and how were you able to adjust?
Previous to interning at law, I took a law course in high school, and that kind of helped me realize I was interested in law and that aspect of health law. I was specializing in global health at MAC, and one of the projects we did was have a mock trial as part of our end of the year project for a global health course. And I realized that in undergrad I didn't have much exposure to health law and the combinations between health systems and legal systems. And so that's why I was interested in this internship. In terms of adjusting, I didn't think it was that bad. It was really intimidating because some of my supervisors were from Harvard Law, and here I was with no law degree. But they were really accommodating in terms of my skill set. So for instance, a lot of the work I did was about the health impact of sexual violence in FGM, and that helped them make the legal argument against the criminalization of such practices.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have from somebody watching online, pretty common question that we get a lot. What did you find most difficult about your internship?
I guess most difficult, I guess at some points it is a bit difficult being by yourself in a new country. But the way I combated that was trying new things here and there. So I traveled to different places. I tried learning Swahili. I was learning new sports, and I thought that kept me busy. And at the end of the day, I had a positive experience. But it is tricky because you always hear that talk of if you ask for help from someone in a foreign country, sometimes they use that to take advantage of you. At the same time, you don't want to be trying to find things out by yourself all the time because you're just going to get lost even further. So just finding that balance, I guess.
Excellent. Another question from someone online. Did you come out of your internship more optimistic about learning after learning about the great work that law is doing, or more pessimistic after seeing some of the grim realities of sexual violence across the world?
Uh, Generally, I'd say more optimistic. It is sometimes frustrating in terms of how many loops some organizations have to go through in order to work towards their goal. As a nonprofit organization, Legal Action Worldwide had to spend a lot of time applying for grants, and it's kind of sad to see that these like Harvard Law educated lawyers aren't really practicing law. They're just looking for grants and applying to them, and that consumes a lot of their time. But at the end of the day, I think they're doing great work, and it seems like they're making strides. They're working with local lawyers and organizations in the region, as well as like UN Women and UN Habitat in order to push their goals, and it seems like they're doing a really good job.
Great. Thank you. Another question from someone online. What issue do you wish you had had more time to explore during your internship, and what do you believe is not receiving enough attention?
Okay. I guess understanding female genital mutilation a bit more thoroughly in terms of the local perspective. One conversation I was having with a physician was the terminology around FGM, and I never actually really understood how FGM is discussed in local communities that practice FGM, because they're not using terms like female genital mutilation. They're using like Swahili words and Arabic words, and I guess understanding how that terminology around the practice shapes the views of those communities. Because if you come from an angle that antagonizes their practice, they're not going to be willing to cooperate with you. And one limitation I had was that I didn't have the security clearance or the ethical clearance to actually go to Somalia and understand the practice in those communities themselves. I was still kind of remotely studying FGM in Kenya. In terms of the second part of the question, I think in general issues around South Sudan don't receive a lot of attention in the media. They have millions of internally displaced people, several refugees. While we try to support them by creating protection of civilian camps and bringing peacekeepers, what we see is that sometimes women and families, they're being raped in those protection of civilian camps. And it seems like at times these families, they don't have many options in terms of whether to endure the ethnic violence happening in South Sudan or to take the support of peacekeepers, but because of the lack of accountability, they're being victims of them too. And I think there could be more media attention towards that.
Another question from someone online. This is actually something that I was thinking about, someone from the health sciences background, but you're now looking at the legal side of things. So how do you hope to incorporate this experience into the work that you do in the future? Is there a legal element to your future, or a physician who dabbles in the legal side?
It's something that I'm still trying to work out. But in general, what I can say is that like female genital mutilation, sexual violence, it just doesn't happen in East Africa alone. What we see is that there's people who've undergone the procedure in East Africa, but they come to Canada, and healthcare providers aren't equipped with the education and knowledge in order to treat them properly and give them the services they need in order to ensure that their health isn't compromised. And so as a potentially future physician, I'd want to be very mindful of that and respect the different cultures of the patients that are coming to see me. In terms of the legal aspect, I do think it'd be nice to still pursue that human rights and health law route. But I think even just the day-to-day interactions and making sure the work we do is ethical, it incorporates the law and the work I did through my internship.
So we're probably coming to a close. We've had a lot of questions online, so thank you for those of you who have asked questions. If you have any others, feel free to type them in. I'm going to quickly jump back to this slide here, which is your learning goals. So this is the academic in me asking this question. Did you achieve all of the goals that you set out to achieve before you went?
I'd say so. I hope so. I do think I have a better understanding of how legal advocacy plays a role in health and health systems, but obviously it's a whole field of its own, and I don't understand either of these fields in much depth, but I think that comes with time. I do have a better understanding of how to push for the issues that you're passionate about. I'm just working with very ambitious lawyers in that law firm, and I do think I got really proficient at looking at social science literature. I'd be looking at coming from undergrad, I was used to using like PubMed and very medical databases, but here you'd use legal journals and different reports from government agencies, and I think I got better at absorbing that information.
Thank you very much. So we'll put out the last call for anyone who has any questions. Please type in the chat box. Otherwise, I will mention that it's reading week here at McMaster, so it's been very quiet on campus. Thank all of you for joining us online. It's probably the largest contingent we've had online so far this term, so that's fantastic. And thank you very much, Shawn, for making the trip from Toronto to be here to present to us here at the McMaster Health Forum today. We really appreciate it. I'll just draw everybody's attention to the slide that's on the screen right now very quickly. If you have any interest in our Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Program as offered through the forum, that first link will give you the information you need to apply. The second link is a link to all of our webinars. So this is one of many webinars we have between now and December the 13th. So please check the schedule and please visit us again, mostly at Wednesdays at 4 with a few exceptions. And the third link there is to our Queen Elizabeth Scholars blog page. So all of our scholars will be writing at least one blog. Some have written multiple blogs, and we'll be slowly posting them on the website there throughout the term. So Shawn will be writing a blog for us if you want to hear more about his experiences. We have some blogs that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks that are just sitting there waiting in the queue. So a little bit more if you're interested in what our scholars have been doing and what they've experienced on their travels. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you again, Shawn. Very informative, very interesting. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you very much.